Cheerily had trouble focusing as she walked ponderously towards the backstage area. Echoes of her sessions with the two fillies still bounced around in her head, and she reveled in them. The start of that session had been everything she had hoped for, but the middle part had left much to be desired. The ending, however, had made up for that. And how? She didn't know where they'd found the energy or the willpower, but those last screams, the thrashing of their bodies as they melted away, it had all just been so exhilarating. Cheerily trembled and shook just remembering it. She attempted to walk in a straight line, but she just couldn't quite pull it off. Analyzing her own feelings, she realized the sensations rushing through her bodies weren't unlike that she felt during one of the many sexual escapades she'd been part of in her wilder years. A little voice at the back of her conscious mind said she ought to be disturbed by this notion, but the dominant part of her psyche was adamant that it was completely normal. After all, those fillies had done unto her a great injustice, and she was doing the entire community a favor by removing their toxic influence from the world. It was natural to feel good about a job well done. It took the mare a few moments to realize she'd stopped walking and was now leaning heavily against a nearby stage wall as she panted, drops of sweat running down her body. Taking a deep breath, she finally regained her composure, taking off around the last corner, separating her from her destination. Almost at once, she spotted the only pony working in the backstage area, Snails. The aquamarine-maned colt with a golden coat was oblivious to her presence, preoccupied as he was by the task of untangling several ropes from a knot. Seeing him there gave Cheerily mixed feelings about it. On one hand, he was probably one of the least disruptive pupils in her class. He was an utter moron, but at least he had the decency to not interrupt her constantly. But on the other hand, his blatant lack of intelligence gave him an innocent demeanor that Cheerily would love to break. But the play could only be so long, and there simply wasn't enough time for her to do the things she really wanted to do. With a sigh, she shook her head, resigning herself to her original plans for him. It'd be over far too fast for her taste, but at least she had found some way of connecting him to the events of the play, even back here. "Oh, Snails," she called out sweetly, "I think it's time you get into position." He looked around in confusion. "Oh, hey, Miss Cheerily," he said dorkily. The ropes got stuck, and I was just—" he began, only to be cut off by Cheerily as she started pushing him gently in the direction opposite the one she'd come from. Now, Snails, you know full well what I told you. After the break, you need to hold the rope on the X," she said slowly, pronouncing every extra word carefully. "The rope on the X," Snails echoed. Just a few meters ahead, some pony had indeed chalked a big white X on the stage floor, and a long, sturdy rope hung down from the ceiling right above it. Snails went to stand on the mark, without hesitation, and took the end of the rope between his teeth. Cheerily nodded approvingly at him, and his chest swelled up with pride. It almost made Cheerily feel bad. Almost, but not quite. She put her ear against the thick wall separating the stage from the backstage area, trying to listen in on the scene. She could barely make out what the two ponies talking to each other, and even though she couldn't understand what they were saying, it gave her a rough idea of the current situation on stage. For the upteenth time, she had to chastise herself for drawing out her fun for too long, and reveling in the aftermath of it, as she realized she had only gotten there in the nick of time. If she kept that up, she'd mess up sooner or later, and she knew it. She made a mental note to adhere to her schedule more rigorously from there on out, comforted by the fact that she'd gotten almost halfway through the show without any major incidents. She closed her eyes as she listened to the sounds reaching her through the wall, her imagination creating a scene inside of her head. She saw Sweetie Belle and Apple Bloom quarrel about what they should do next. She saw the king shoot down every single idea her last remaining knight came up with, and she saw her finally lamenting enough was enough, that she needed a good night's rest to mull it over. She witnessed the king curse the sun for still being so high in the sky, felt her reach up for a rope that disappeared somewhere in the darkness above the stage, and watched her pull it down with all her might. Then, the sun fell from the sky. As it descended, the technician pony in the box above the tribunes doused most of the lights, while the orchestra started to play loudly. The king's lament had begun, and Shirley's eyes flew open as soon as she heard the first few notes. Her gaze shot up instantly. The world seemed to slow down, to a crawl as the schoolteacher saw a huge spotlight, the sun, come crashing down from the ceiling, exactly above the X she had planted. Snails had spotted it as well, and he tugged on the rope with his mouth, desperately, wondering why it didn't work this time. Why it didn't allow him to gently let the spotlight down like it had before. His only conscious thought concerned not letting his teacher, and every pony else, down during these crucial moments, and so he kept on trying the rope. But it wouldn't budge, and the spotlight didn't slow down. Moments before impact, both Cheerilee and Snails lowered their gaze and looked each other in the eye. Cheerilee mouthed the word, "Goodbye," and broke out into a smile. But the actual word itself was lost in the rush of music. Snails stared at her in confusion. Why? Why was she smiling? Why was she just standing there? Why wasn't she... Wham! The spotlight crashed onto the colt. Small pieces of glass shattered over the floor and flew into the air as the music hit a crescendo. To Cheerilee, it looked like a slow-motion explosion of tiny, shiny shards erupting from the younger pony, temporarily hiding him from her eyes. The combination of the orchestra music and the sudden cloud of tiny glass splinters was simply too much for Cheerilee's romantic soul to bear, and she shed a single tear at the beauty of it. The world finally kicked back into its usual gear as the tiny pieces of glass clattered onto the floor and the orchestra stopped playing. Finally, she could admire the fruits of her labors. In the form of Snail's broken body lying underneath the huge spotlight. Most of it had been crushed from the middle down. Even his upper torso had hundreds of tiny cuts and lacerations all over it, although he didn't get directly hit from the falling object there. His normal golden coat was soaked red in many places already. Cheerilee took a few steps forward to admire the small pool of blood flowing from the many fragments of glass on the floor. The wannabe crystals crunching noisily under her hooves. As she got closer to the spotlight, she started noticing the smell of burnt flesh impregnating the air. It seemed to get warmer with every step she took as well. She walked around to the other side of the spotlight and finally realized why. Cheerilee had known that spotlights got very hot, of course, but she hadn't expected the thing to retain the heat for quite that long. Snail's entire backside was covered in blisters, singed flesh, and smoldered fur, and she noticed it was still spreading. With a high-pitched hissing sound, a patch of fur on Snail's back suddenly ignited, the small flame dancing around playfully on the pony's back. Cheerilee looked at it with fascination, but did not dare to get any closer. She was already uncomfortably warm where she was standing, a meter or two away. The teacher pony gasped in shock as Snails groaned and slowly opened an eye, looking around shakily, clearly still dazed. Miss Cheerilee? I can't feel my legs. And what smells? he said as he craned his neck around to look over his shoulder. He immediately saw the small, but growing flame. And even he was smart enough to link the horrid smell and what was assailing his nostrils. "Fire! Fire! Miss Cheerily! Fire!" he yelled as he tried to crawl away, thrashing his upper body around wildly in an effort to get loose. Because he was trapped underneath the spotlight, and with his hind legs out of order, the situation was hopeless from the onset. All he did with his erratic movements was fan the flames even more. In a matter of seconds, various little flames were dancing around his body, and he screamed as their hot tongues licked his tender flesh. More blisters and boils appeared all around the flames, and they consumed everything within reach. The fire grew and grew, pulling more and more of his body into its deadly embrace, eager to feast on what had now been set loose upon him. The golden pony cried out as the embers tickled or spread across his body and over his face, his vision immediately taken up almost entirely by the flames. The pain was excruciating, as if 1,000 little critters were gnawing on him with hungering teeth, and all water was being drawn from his body at the same time. Cheerily watched in awe as the spectacle unfolded before her eyes. She hadn't expected a show at this stage in her plan, but it was. And it was breathtaking. She noted how several flames were already burning out, leaving his body charred black, cracks and fissures appearing in his dried-out flesh as snails desperately thrashed about. He started hitting himself in the face with his hooves, trying his best to put out the flames burning there. Every hit left deep imprints in his weakened, boiling meat, but the flames would not be conquered. At most, they retreated for a single second, only to come back with a vengeance. Snails screamed in agony once again, and panted with the effort as his life flashed before his eyes. Losing blood, and the loss of blood completing with the fire to see which of them could kill him first. I messed that up. In the end, the fire won as the superheated air invaded the colt's lungs, singeing him on the inside. As his screams stopped, he wheezed for air, every breath like 1,000 daggers forced down his throat. His vision started to blur, and black spots sprung up everywhere. Suddenly, by chance, the flames moved away for a moment, and he could barely make out Cheerily, just standing there, watching. And was she laughing? The colt let out a dry, rasping sound as the flames blew back into his face, his eyesight giving out as the orange tongues dug in. If he had any strength left, he might have screamed the moment his eyes popped and melted away, flames immediately claiming the now empty eye sockets for themselves and licking the inside of his skull. But he was already far too gone. The colt cheerily laughed as she coughed and sneezed a few times. The smell had gotten too much, even for her taste. But she continued watching as the lifeless husk, formerly known as snails, burned out. A little voice at the back of her head asked her if she ought to find some water, in case anything else caught fire. But she was too memorized by the flames to care at that point. She finally snapped out of her fascination when the last of the flames died, leaving only a blackened form, roughly reminiscent of a pony, in its wake. Panic hit her like a truck when she realized what she had just done. She drifted from her schedule, mere moments after she'd promised herself not to do that. She mentally hit herself over the head as she racked her brain, trying to remember where she was supposed to have gone, instead of staring at the pretty fire, and the answer calmed her down quite a bit. She'd only have to skip leaving Snip's costume in the final scene, which was different from the one he'd already been having, in the right place for him. She shrugged, He could probably find it himself that one time. He knew where she kept it, and it wouldn't be a problem. She laughed softly as she went down some stairs to get beneath the stage, and then headed for the prompt corner. For a moment there, she'd thought she'd really messed up. But there were now only 3 left to go, and she was still firmly in control. Nothing would go wrong tonight. Nothing at all.